For those of you, though, who are new and who don't know this, I'm Chuck Preston. I am the senior curator at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center and founding curator, actually, in charge of the Draper Museum of Natural History. We're in our 12th year, the 10th year of the Draper, as I've said all year so far. Celebrate our 10th anniversary, but this is the 12th year, actually, of the Lunchtime Expeditions. We began that, as some of you recall, and some of you were here for the very first one, I know. To begin developing a following for our natural history program here. So thrilled to have you today. I think you'll be really excited about the program. You know, it finally feels a little bit like fall out there, doesn't it? Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. He hails from Bozeman, Montana. He's an avid hiker and hunter and angler. He currently operates a consulting business specializing in strategic planning, issue management on really a wide range of natural resource management issues across the country and literally the world. I first became acquainted with him, gosh, it was over 20 years ago, pretty close to 20 years ago, when he was with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and they were a cooperator on a project I directed at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in its transition from federal Superfund site to a national wildlife refuge, which it has become now successfully. And this guy was a big part of that. He's also worked with the Sonoran Institute and the Audubon Society, among others, and is the author of, here it is. Strangely enough, I have it right here, of this book, Flora of Montana's Gallatin region in Greater Yellowstone's northwest corner. He'll be sticking around to sign copies of this book upstairs at the museum store right after the presentation. So I hope you will avail yourself of that. Wonderful book, by the way. So let me please introduce and please welcome Whitney Tilt.
Thanks very much. You might wonder what someone who is fooling around in an arsenal knows about Flora, and that would actually be a pretty good question. What I'd like to do is a couple things. I'd like to introduce you to the project that is the Northwest Montana Flora Project. I'd like you talk a little bit about some of the flora of this area, but more importantly, why a non-botanist cares about wildflowers and the direct impact that has on the great outdoors. This quote by John Muir is about as good an elocution of why we should care about plants, and those of us who do go out into the woods, how you might treat it, because every time you meet a new plant, it tells you something. So he sits down and makes its acquaintance, and that's what I did over the course of the last 10 years. My qualifications, first and foremost, I am not a botanist. Very important. I'm actually, once upon a time, I was a trained wildlife biologist. But I first started doing wildlife or wildflower watching when I was moving hand lines, and anybody in this room who's moved hand lines knows it's a great time to have your mind doing something else. I noticed today there were several hand lines that proved that they got a little cold last night because they were frosting the grass instead of wetting it. So, as Chuck suggested, a very varied background in natural resources, most of which has been around conflict, whether it's tigers, whether it's water, whether it's black-footed ferrets. They all themselves don't have to be managed, but we have to manage the interactions between the people and the resource. So that's my credentials. But more importantly, I reacquainted myself with this part of the world 11 years ago when I moved back out here. And of course, those of you who have read any of Wallace Stegner know that he has this wonderful line about having a society that would match the scenery. And in this case, not surprisingly, the scenery includes an incredibly rich flora. Over some 2,000 species of vascular plants representing more than 117 different families. You might notice the author. He is the one who lost his life to the bear, I think it was 3 years ago. He came out here every summer and probably has, hands down, the most definitive publication on the plants that are extant in this area. So, do we need another field guide? I mean, just walk into the Cody Museum bookstore and you'll just see how many of them are. But in fact, these are some of the volumes I had, and it became so frustrating for me that someone wandering along a trail, stumbling over a flower that was so obvious that even I could see it, then when you went to at least 7, 8, or 9 field guides, it wasn't there. And yet it wasn't some little diminutive draba or something. This was a flower that was saying, here, I'm here. When am I? So that led me to begin a project that led to this book. And it's entitled Montana's Gallatin Region because as a non-botanist, I did not feel I quite had the panache to say that it was the Flora of the Yellowstone. I do personally, and this has been reinforced by many, many people that know a lot more than myself, I would argue that if you want one field guide that will actually show you what you are seeing in Yellowstone, this is hands down the best. Why? Because it's about one of the few that are written to the region rather than to the Northern Rockies. And when you have such a rich flora, it's very hard to write one book, no matter how many pretty pictures you have, that captures such a rich flora. So again, when I went out to be a pretend botanist, I wanted to describe plants that were readily encountered and that they were easily identifiable, so that there are many flowers that when you look at it, you say, well, that's a lupin. Now, not all of us care which lupin it is. It's a paintbrush. Put the name of the color of the paintbrush in front of it, and you're probably right. That's complicated greatly by the fact that they freely hybridize, and if you are all botanists and familiar with this region, none of you would agree on most of the paintbrush if you had to be asked to pull it down to an actual species or subspecies. And most importantly, that it's representative of the families. The broad one, if you see one geranium, and then next time you see the other 2 that are around here, you probably say, oh, that looks like a geranium. So that it gets you at what you're actually seeing. The other thing that was important to me as a naturalist, someone who has trained children, trained myself, enjoyed the outdoors, is let's give the user of the field guide something to go by than just one pretty picture of what the flower looks like in its very finest, but only looks like that for a very brief time. So each species has many more than one flower. It basically shows the flower, it shows the plant, it shows the botanical drawing if it's around and available in the general market. And then in front, we describe the flowers by the colors. So that was the start. And in doing this, I was, from the start, it was a partnership. Chuck alluded to the fact that I worked for a group called the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And it became very clear the only way we can succeed in protecting the natural resources that we're blessed with is in partnership. And when you think about all our times or if you watch presidential debates and all, you don't see a lot of partnership. And that's why you also may or may not see a lot of accomplishment. So in the West, many of us live out here because of the wonderful people. 2 of them here, Clyde Asvig, a very well-known landscape artist that lives up in Clyde Park, Daphne Gillum, whose maps and all grace, well, most recently, David Quammen's new book on zoonotic diseases. They gave their artistry to the project. Board member of this fine institution, Rip McIntosh, many of his photographs and his enthusiasm are throughout this. And then, of course, I did have to have a couple of plant nerds and a few actual botanists helping me. And MSU is the repository for Montana's botanical collections, and Matt Lavin was unbelievably helpful. All the proceeds of this book do not go to me. They go to the Gallatin Valley Land Trust and the Big Sky Community Foundation for preservation of open trails and easements. So, now all of you obviously have spent a lot of time around here, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting in Cody in October. But throughout this region we have incredible varied flora, and again, the physical aspect of it drives what you're going to find on the ground. So if you're up in these broad mountain valleys, such as in the Bridgers, on south-facing slopes, one of the first things you'll see is a plant named actually after Wyoming, the Wyoming kittentail, and it's one of many similar species that are found here. Moving to the east, up into the Absaroka, you'll find this, in this case, is Slough Creek, but you find the wonderful bog orchids out in these big willow plains that you hope when you're taking these photographs are not being frequented by either a moose or a grizzly bear. I'm sure you all agree the strangest thing to be when you're out photographing is making a lot of noise to yourself. Then obviously when you get into these mountain streams and valleys, they create much moisture, shadier climates, and we have many of the wetland species such as the yellow monkey flower that we find there under these understories of Engelmann, cottonwood, and aspen. And then when we put our sneakers on and we get higher, we drive the Beartooth Highway and cheat. Then you can get up high and into the subalpine and alpine, where you might as well be in Alaska out on the tundra. It's the exact same, and many of the species are actually found at 8,000 feet or found at sea level on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And you have, again, these lupines, and in this case, the alpine paintbrush. That's this beautiful pink magenta, but in fact may be a hybrid of 2 or 3 others at any time. And then down in our more dry grasslands, often dominated by non-native grasses, that word non-native is increasingly becoming something that we might as well forget about. If anybody in this room has read 1493, you'll get some idea that maybe we better start recognizing that there is no such thing as a native species. While there are many introduced species that are very obnoxious in their behavior towards natives, kind of like some of us who moved back into this region and will never be able to claim that we're native. But out on these, for instance, smooth brome and things like this, you have these wonderful, in this case, one of the latest bloomers in this region, the gay feather. So wonderful plants, a great richness of variety, but that I'm not a botanist. I don't care if they're going to reclassify a plant into something else because they've parsed it in a laboratory. What I care about is what is it indicative of the larger environment. So the next steps for me are, this book will be republished probably next year as the Flora of Yellowstone, because at that point I'll have done enough work with the park and all that I can be confident in that. There are about 400 species that are described already. And part of that was through the development of mobile apps. Now, if I were standing in front of you a year ago, I'm not sure I would have known what a mobile app was, never mind be part of building them. But it's become increasingly obvious it's a very dynamic tool, and I'll give you a quick demonstration of it shortly. We're also, we've collected thousands of images. If any of you have ever gone into the Yellowstone National Park digital library to find photographs of plants, you recognize that many of them are really of poor quality. So both for the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and for the Yellowstone National Park, all these images are going to be made available to update their online resources. With the hope that this actually works, I'm going to introduce you to the world of the mobile app. This is an iPad, and if we go to the icon, we have a very familiar site, but at this point, this is where looks like a field guide, right? You can go look at the maps. We can go look at how to use. We can look at, if we can't remember what plant families are, you can go through any of them and remember what they are. But now watch how the pages of book change. So if I want to look at Berbiaceae, then every Berbiaceae, I chose that as opposed to the Asteraceae because there's only one versus about 100. But you can go right to members of that family. Well, a book, that would be a little bit more difficult. But more importantly, does anybody have a favorite flower from this region?
Shooting star.
Okay, shooting star. So let's go browse plants, and then we, whoops, the problem about this is my fingers are fatter than the screen. So we start putting in shooting, search. Oh, look, there's a shooting star. Oh, I'm glad it was there. But now we look at the fact that that's what most of us know the shooting star is. But I said now we can have picture the flower, the plant, the botanical. You can tap on it and expand it. You can look at its range. And then you can look at a description of it, and then you can find some fun facts about it. That pretty much looks like a field guide. But how many of us know what we're actually looking at? So now you see in the shooting star these series of symbols. Well, those symbols are what drives an app in a way that a field guide can never do, because we can search by characteristics, what we know or don't know about the plant. So for instance, if we were looking for the shooting star, we might call it pink, we might call it purple, so we'd hit pink. Now instead of looking at 350, 400 plants, we're down to 58 that have pink flowers. We can describe the, whether it's basil or whatnot. If I put basil in there, that has basil or whorled, I guess that's whorled, then all of a sudden, I'm not looking at 54, I'm only looking at 4, and I can sit there and hit show me, and I see the 4 that meet those 2 criteria. So, and again, you can go to any of them and up comes the photographs. You can do this by elevation, you can do it by time of year, you can do it by the size of the plant relative to your foot. You can do it by, we mentioned this dirty little word, you can do it by, actually apparently there are no pink noxious weeds that are basil. But so for instance, if we just wanted to look at the bad guys, the ones that are listed by this region's state departments as obnoxious, we can pick up anyone. This is public number 1, enemy number 1 on a lot of our national forests around here. And in this case, we'll also give information on how to control it. Does it respond to herbicides? Does it, et cetera? So that is the world according to the iPad. It can also go on your phone. It doesn't need the internet, so it can go up with you. And when a biologist friend of mine said, oh, when are you going to do the app? I said, I leave my phone behind when I go hiking and all. And he goes, no, from now on, bring your bear spray and your phone, leave your field guides, your notes, your compass, and your maps home. They're all on your phone. You'll be 10 pounds lighter going into the outback. And the only thing I now add is a little solar charger. And I still carry my maps, because and a good old-fashioned compass. So that the fun part about this is, again, the ability. So Chuck is using this app tomorrow, and he comes across one that's missing. He calls me up, we agree on what's missing, and the next time the app is updated to your phone, that species is on it. One of you points out that in my dyslexic inabilities, I've misspelled a word in the description of a shooting star, the next time it's updated, it's gone. You don't have that luxury with books. We're stuck with errata sheets until we republish. So we have these out now for Glacier, Yellowstone, the Wasatch, and Colorado. We're working with the University of Washington on the Flora of Washington, and we have a number of other applications underway. So again, what drives it for me is we are giving it free. It costs a whopping $4.99 otherwise, but the Teton Science School, the Montana Outdoor Science School, the Yellowstone Association, all are using these apps on iPads and on tablets to get youth interested in the outdoors, because you're taking that love of videophilia that we'll talk more of in a second, and when I don't know how to work my own app, I look for the youngest person in the room, preferably under 15, and ask them, how do I do what I'm supposed to be doing? So that's what drives me to spend time in my off time to develop these, is because of the powerful way to get information on the outdoors to our younger folks. So let's now spend the balance of this talk looking at a little bit of why should we care. So what is the link? Why should those of us who may love wildflowers or whatnot, how does that link to, say, the future of our public domain? Well, as all of you know better than I do, we are blessed out here with an incredible legacy of public lands and access to those lands. And I would argue that that's very much at risk for a number of things I'll outline now. For those of us who care about the outdoors, the 21st century has a certain number of danger signs, including a growing disinterest in the outdoors. Easier to get people into a mall, even in Bozeman, than, say, to Bridger Bowl or the Gallatin National Forest. We have a conservation literacy that is getting dumber and dumber. And then overall, for a country that is very rich in almost everything it does, we have an appalling lack of investment in our natural resources in the outdoors. How we treat the outdoors is directly related and shaped by both the duration and the character of our experience. This photo is back when I led whale watches off Stillwagon Bank, and you can see at least one gentleman in a brown coat who seems a little disinterested, that even though he's got a humpback whale that's sounding right in front of the boat. And at the same time, though, you have those that are interested. And most teachers will say you focus on the ones that show interest and hope that the one that shows the disinterest grows up one day to have that interest. After 50 years of increase, we have a steady decline in nature-based recreation. Now, I might say that the latest survey that has come out just 2 months ago shows an increase in the number of hunters nationwide and an increase of 11% in the number of anglers. Interestingly enough, the number one reason people feel that is true is because of the recession. People are staying home, and one of the things that's more affordable to do than a lot of things are to go buy your resident fishing license and go fishing. So it is, in fact, just perhaps an aberration, not of growing interest in the outdoors, but because of the need to find some more economic pastime. Now, many of us in this room who are avid hunters and fishermen knows there's nothing economic about it. When you start playing with optics and new toys, it can get very expensive. But we have also what I mentioned earlier, what has been tagged by the experts as videophilia, an increasing love and fascination with electronics. And anybody who has children and grandchildren and all probably has seen that. And the Wall Street Journal, in fact, had an article last week on the fact that parents are becoming so distracted with their mobile devices that, in fact, emergency rooms are seeing an increase in infant injuries due to mom or dad or caregiver sitting on the phone rather than paying attention to the child. We also have an incredible fear factor. We see it less out here, but I've seen it even in Bozeman, that where we were all let go out the back door with an admonishment not to show up until dinner and not to make too much of a nuisance out of ourselves, increasingly parents are not letting their children run outside, or if it is, their outdoor activities are things like soccer, which, I'm sorry, a soccer field is not quite the same place as, say, this fort that was built alongside a stream. This fort, by the way, was then torn down by the Homeowners Association shortly after these children had illicitly swiped some spare lumber from a house that was being built. But it wasn't the swiping that got everybody. They felt that it was unseemly that children were out bouncing around in the outdoors. Obviously, things like West Nile, hantavirus, things like that are also give parents cause for why their children shouldn't be playing outside. But as this tagline says, are we increasingly raising a generation under protective house arrest? And I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, we are. A lot of people are starting to look at this. I think the person who's still got the best handle on it and set the benchmark for it is Richard Louv. He termed this increased detachment from the outdoors as nature deficit disorder. The caption in yellow I love. I like to play indoors because that's where the outlets are. It's hard to believe. Interestingly enough, Richard Louv and many others are increasingly tying this detachment from the outdoors to very real mental and physical well-being questions. Obesity, ADHD, loss of respect for nature, ignorance, sense of community, all are under onslaught when we're not getting outdoors. As far as a legacy to our children, we're increasingly comfortable in our arrogance, and we have an increasing, I think, intolerance for any view that doesn't match our own. I don't know how the debates down in Wyoming are, but in Montana, where we have a very tightly fought Senate race between Mr. Rayburg and Mr. Tester, it is not very polite. This is a New Yorker cartoon that appeared many years ago. You can see he didn't quite get the geography right. Because we've got all these people, but they're not all necessarily in the right areas. But so you have your organized tax dodgers. That's probably most of the state. We know the mad bombers were not here, but they're over here. We have the right-wing religious fanatics. That's, I think, Bozeman now. The obsessed anti-environmentalists are certainly Missoula and Bozeman would be where most of the obsessed ones. I don't think obsessed environmentalisms are hanging out in Billings quite as much. But anyway, you get it's the characterization of who we are. And you get into a community, that's who you are, and it's very tough to get out of it. And we don't like to hang out with people who don't think the way we do. And that doesn't really lead to a heightened discourse in either politics or the outdoors. Case in point, the three issues that are perpetually on the front page of every single newspaper in the region, I don't know what they do without these topics to report on. We've spent millions of dollars on them, and we have very little to show for it. They, of course, are wolves, bison, and snowmobiles. I mean, can you think of three more things that truly show how badly we play with each other and how unwilling we are to meet people in the middle? Most importantly, say, snowmobiles and the cross-country skier. The wolf advocates on Madison Avenue and the people who raise prize bulls and livestock on the fringes of the Shoshone National Forest. Again, there's no willingness to step into the other person's boots and see whether or not they can be tolerant of that. The lack of investment, I think a lot of people would believe that we spend a lot of time and effort on our natural resources, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time debunking that. we have made tremendous progress, but as this presidential election and most of the Senate races and all show, there's no commitment that really crosses across the political spectrum, doesn't cross the aisle very often. It doesn't cross into socioeconomics, and it has, unfortunately, no more endurance than a fad. This was a wonderful Earth Day cartoon, and the guy with the finger in his nose is mankind, if you can't read it. But this is not a new problem. This is Aldo Leopold, who is, for those of us in wildlife management, is kind of our greatest sage. In 1947, he wrote this. Despite a century of propaganda, conservation still proceeds at a snail's pace. Progress consists largely of letterhead, pieties, and convention oratory. On the back 40, we still slip back 2 steps forward for every forward stride. 1947, 2012. Unfortunately, there's not much difference. 2 years ago, we spent $5 billion for conservation. $5 billion, that's a lot of money. It, in fact, is 1/8 of 1 cent of your tax dollar, is the entire commitment to conservation. And by conservation, I mean water, land, soil. It includes the Farm Bill. It includes a very broad spectrum, not just bunny hugging and fish and wildlife resources. The use of the outdoors creates a minimum of $192 billion in annual economic activity. So that's a heck of an investment in one of our largest economic strengths. That $192 billion does not include a single valuation of what we call environmental services. And that is, what's the price of clean water being delivered by the Clark Fork or the Shoshone to our door rather than having to treat it? What is the cost of clean air that we don't have to spend treating someone for lost man days because of emphysema? None of those are even valued in this. So pretty significant stuff. To bring it home, and I wish both candidates last night would agree on what this dollar looks like. But in fact, and this is again 2 years old because it takes a long time for them to agree on what the budget dollars actually look like, you see where the dollars go. Payments to individuals, 62 cents. Discretionary is the entire government budget as we think of it. Interest on that debt without paying it down, 6 cents. Defense, 20 cents. So out of that 12 cents is where the entire government comes, and that's where the 1 penny comes from. Unfortunately, we don't get to play many discussions where people actually look at what this dollar, if you will see between now and the election, this dollar shown to you by different candidates looking different. I don't know how this diagram can be different. This is what was actually spent in FY 2010. It can't be played with, but they play with it. So I've spent way too many years inside the Beltway working with groups like OMB and all, and a lot of my research coming up will continue to examine this in an effort to build a greater commitment to natural resource management. One solution that's good for all of us, no matter of where we are, the age we are, or whatnot, is get outside. Go meet a blue grouse. They're probably not going to greet you quite as nicely this time of year. One, because they're heading up the mountain, and two, people are chasing after them, huffing and puffing. And I should have changed this, Chuck, to say go visit a museum, or one as good as this that connects so well to the outdoors. But get outside, catch fish, get on the water, grab a bird, do some banding, whatever it is, get outside. That's the #1 solution. Some of this other stuff I bring up because it's so important for us to realize the bigger picture and how things like the loss of community affect us. I've touched only very briefly on some very big topics, and I'd be delighted to take any questions or have anyone tell me where I went crazy. As I did say, Gallatin Valley Land Trust and all are recipients of all the proceeds of the book, along with its Big Sky counterpart. So thank you very much.